And we were, I suppose, a very amateurish version of many of the groups that were up and coming on the national scene at the time. People like John Mayall and Ainsley Dunbar and Fleetwood Mac and those sort of bands that were in their heyday. And a year or so later, when we took a stab at being professional, immediately before forming Jethro Tull, we were doing a mixture of blues, jazz blues, and something else which I don't think was ever really defined, but was probably best shown by the Graham Bond organisation, which was a kind of very hybrid music form that was really quite raucous and exciting, but derived from, I suppose, jazz, blues, and rock influences all kind of thrown together, but it came out sounding something uniquely different. We were very influenced by Graham Bond, and to a lesser extent by some of the sort of jazz blues bands of the time. But that was really an unsatisfactory experience altogether, because we were playing at a time when soul music, if you like, the forerunner of disco, was rampant in all the northern clubs, and in an effort to find an audience, we moved down to London as the John Evan Band, and after about a week of starving and having no money to pay rent or buy any coal to sort of heat the rented accommodation we had, everybody went home to Blackpool except me and the bass player Glenn Cornick, and we teamed up with Mick Abrahams and Clive Bunker from Luton, because we were actually living in Luton. It was cheaper than living in London, Luton being on the outskirts of London, so to speak. And at that point we struggled on with a few inherited dates from the John Evan Band, and made our debut at a variety of southern blues clubs under a succession of names, none of which was Jethro Tull at that point, because the theory was that we were so bad that the only way we could get return bookings at any of the clubs we played at was to pretend to be somebody else. And we used to arrive at a club where we were booked. Our agent had told us we were booked, and we would look down the list of bands appearing that night, and whichever band we hadn't heard of before, we would assume that must be us, and promptly introduce ourselves by that name to the club proprietor, and proceed to try and turn around our series of bad gigs and ill luck. So I suppose at the time, probably early in '68, when we actually did get a return booking at the Marquee Club, we were obliged to stick with the name that we had that week, which happened to be Jethro Tull. It was just one of many names. Had we been rebooked at a major club, having gone down well as a band the week before, we would have been called something different. So it was just fortuitous, really, that name happened to be the one and happened to stick. And from that point on, really, it was a question of consolidating our little reputation in the South by playing the other blues clubs that were cropping up elsewhere in the country. And by the middle of '68, we'd really found, without realising it, quite a large following throughout Britain, albeit a couple of hundred people here, a couple of hundred people there. So that when we were invited to appear on the 1968 National Jazz and Blues Festival, whatever it was called at the time, at a place called Sunbury near London, we were surprised to find our audience sort of collected in one place and out there in strength. And it was said, and I must admit it felt like it at the time, I mean, it was quite amazing, it was said that we were the hit of the festival, inasmuch as we were the surprise group from nowhere that suddenly made good conspicuously. Even so, the lethargy of the British music papers meant that we derived, I think, one small paragraph in Melody Maker for our pains, and that was about it. I mean, the press, as usual, being drunk in the bar, somewhere in the bar tent, as was typical for those days, and probably no less typical now, except maybe the drug is different, I don't know. Anyway, enough of my cynicism towards the press. So, after '68 and that particular highlight, we had a record, our first album, which did very well in Britain, relatively speaking, as a first album. It did reasonably well in Europe, and it created a bit of a stir, particularly in America, largely because of the album cover, which, at my insistence, had no name on the front and depicted us looking like old men. I mean, even older than we are in fact now. And that seemed to amuse people, or at least stimulate a bit of, interest in the band from afar. And we were eventually asked to go over and play a small and spectacularly unsuccessful tour in the United States, which really we did because it featured a few worthwhile places like the Fillmore's East and West, operated by Bill Graham, and the Boston Tea Party, which was another sort of meaningful gig of the time.
Do you remember when you recorded the first album? I mean, it was later called This Was, but it was the first album for you, and probably the first time you've been in a recording studio, wasn't it?
Well, doing the first album wasn't our first visit to the studio. We had in fact been in to make a few demos, sort of 67-ish, which really hadn't caught anybody's attention, any of the record companies, that is. In fact, when we made the first album, we touted around during the early part of '68 for a record producer and a record deal, but with absolutely no success whatsoever. A number of record producers were wheeled down to the Marquee Club to look at us, but found us to be not to their liking. And